It's a new form of event that we're running from UK and a Changing Europe, which is intended to dig a little bit deeper into the research that underpins the work that that's done through the central office in UK and a Changing Europe. So we're very okay, I'm getting a question, someone who is just getting a screen for a YouTube video. Hannah, I wonder if you could just look into that. Thank you. So this is a new format. As I say, it's a bit different to the isolation insights that UK and a Changing Europe has run in the past, in the sense that it digs more deeply into the underlying research. So we will have PowerPoint presentations from each of the three teams presenting today. And we're also particularly asking you to fill in the survey that is available under the Slido system, just to let us know what works well and where we might be able to improve through the session. So I'm thrilled to be introducing three really significant projects in the migration space, each of which is working on the ground with the real impact, the real application of the new rules that have come into force after Brexit. We've got a project called Feeding the Nation, led by Dr. Roxana Barbulescu, which is funded under the ESRC's COVID urgency program, which is looking at migration in the context, particularly of the agricultural sector. We've got the EU Migrant Worker project based at the University of Cambridge with Professor Catherine Bernard, who's also Deputy Director of UK and a Changing Europe, and Fiona Costello, which is working in particular in the east of England. And then we have the EU Rights Hub based at the University of York, led by Professor Charlotte O'Brien, and Dr. Alice Welsh will also be involved in presenting that project today. Now, we have the Slido system in place, so we're looking forward to answering your questions as they come in. Before the event even got started, we have one question, which is good news. One of the good things about Slido is that you as the audience are able both to ask questions, but also to vote for questions that have already been asked. So rather than asking a question that's a sort of minor variation on something that's already up there, I'd encourage you to vote for questions that have already been written if they're ones that interest you, so that we can get this brilliant expert panel to answer the questions that are most pressing for you arising out of these projects. I don't want to talk anymore. I'll hand over to Roxana Barbulescu for the first presentation. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much for the invitation to present findings from our project in this afternoon to everyone. So just give me a moment because my computer is playing up on me just in this right moment, and we did test it earlier. There was no issue then. So, no, I'm not sure. Sorry. I don't know why it's playing up. Yes, there we go. Apologies for that. So I will present today some preliminary findings from a project that I've been working on for the past year. And this is a project looking at seasonal workers, in particular in the agriculture sector, and even more so in horticulture. This project started last year in October, and we are 1 year in. Essentially, the data that I'll be presenting today and findings come from fieldwork that has been collected throughout this last season from June to October. And what we did when we set up the project, on which I work with many colleagues, and I have the great fortune to work with Carlos Vargas Silva from the University of Oxford, Bethany Robertson at Leeds, and we are also collaborating with an illustrator who will be producing artistic illustrations, and we'll organize as well an exhibition, so keep in touch. And if you're interested to learn more about this particular topic or the project, find us on Twitter and visit our website. What we are trying to do with this project is to look at 2 dimensions. So we're talking and interviewing seasonal migrant workers, but we're also talking to farmers. So what I will be doing and presenting to you today is just some brief trends, some main trends that are emerging from the research. We just completed field work at the end of the season, and now in October. So what is happening in the UK, and how has the situation of seasonal workers been handled through time? UK has brought in workers from overseas, migrants from overseas since the early post-war period. And the UK is not alone in bringing workers for agriculture. Most developed nations do. And one very well-known case, for example, is the US. There are differences in how this is organized. For example, the UK, something that UK does very well is to regulate the recruitment agencies who can bring workers. They need to be first certified by the Gang Master and Labor Authority, and then they are also appointed by DEFRA, those who can manage and operate within the seasonal pilot, for example. So having said that, there's been considerable change, and I would even say radical change over the past few years. And this has to do with the fact that while in the past, seasonal workers were brought in through the visa system, so immigration, simple immigration, or through the regular regime, as the freedom of movement, as UK joined the EU and was part of the freedom of movement, it started bringing workers from primarily Central and Eastern Europe, and that is still the majority of workers today in the sector, and through both means. So until 2013, we have a freedom of movement operating, and then a parallel visa system. And the demand was met through these 2 pathways predominantly. Certainly, there were also British workers in the sector, but I will mention them in a few moments. What happened afterwards, certainly we had the referendum, and in 2013, the visa system was stopped, came to a full stop, and the reason for that was that UK already could recruit through direct employment from the EU. So freedom of movement became the only source of bringing workers, seasonal workers, to the UK. This was still the case last year, so we still have access to freedom of movement, and farmers could recruit directly, and they had many returnees that would come year after year and work in the sector. But last year, we also had the seasonal pilot, the seasonal worker pilot for 10,000 places were made available last year. And in addition, there was further efforts to recruit workers from British workers through, for example, you might have heard and come across the Pick for Britain campaign. In 2021, the situation changes drastically, and that is because freedom of movement ends in December, and farmers could then only recruit or bring workers with seasonal, USS. And this could have been workers that only signed up for USS last year, and they only sign up for USS to return this year, not to remain in the UK for the recent period, so over the months, but to return for the next harvest in spring. And the government as well issued 30 additional 1,000 visas. And as of April, there is a connection with the DWP to advertise jobs in the local job office. So even so, today we are in a situation when over 90% of the workers in farming are migrants who are either domiciliated in the UK with USS or have the USS, or are workers under Tier 5 seasonal worker visa. The seasonal worker visa and the tier 5 and the temporary visa route is the only sectorial based visa in the UK immigration system after Brexit. And it's the only route for what would be called as low skilled migration. Based on threshold, education, and previous experience required. So under this free definition would still be under low skilled. That is expressively so low skilled, because in theory, migrants could come, for example, under the youth mobility scheme. But I've looked at, for example, 2019, and I found that under that route in the immigration system, only 18 people came to work in horticulture, forestry, and wider agriculture. And we don't know if they were pickers, but within the sector, only 18 people applied for that visa. So this is really important, especially in the current context, when particularly this visa, the seasonal worker visa tier 5, has been extended to bring in workers for lorry drivers, poultry workers, and butchers. It is exactly an extension of this visa system under the same rules and regulations with the same administrators of the visa. So it becomes even more critical to the immigration system as we encounter it today. So as I mentioned earlier, that we spoke with farmers as well as with workers. So just to give you a flavor of the shortages in the sector and where they are at, we found that 8 in 10 of the farmers, they had difficulties to employ and to recruit seasonal workers this year compared with the previous year. 5 in 10 find it difficult and very difficult to navigate the new immigration system. And for this particular question, we have also high non-response rate, which is also interesting, I think. 6 in 10 of the farms that we spoke to had employed the same number of British workers as in 2018. So despite these further efforts, investments, and campaigns to bring British workers in the field, in the sector, it wasn't as successful. This is not a blanket finding. Some farms did go to these routes and recruit more local workers. But it is really a challenge for especially the large employers. And this would vary. The need for seasonal workers would vary from 20 to 1,500, which is much, much more difficult to bring in, to recruit locally 1,500 workers. Just to give you now a flavor of what those findings look like, the end for this is 40 farmers. So we found that 21% of the farmers we spoke to had their needs for seasonal workers met in 2021. But the majority report is 79% reported shortages. And just imagine any workplace, your workplace dealing with a shortage of 10, 20%. 20% was the most common one. And how would you reorganize budgets, investment activity? In response, we see that farmers are adapting, and as a result, one of the measures is to reduce production, which is quite a concern from the point of view of food security, but also the very survival of the sector and thriving, the further progress of the sector. And it's tremendously sad because we've been speaking also with families that have had the farm for generations, and some are as old as the Tower of London. So there are very important questions to have here, and the industry often says you either import the workers or export the industry. So this is a serious concern. Moving forward, agriculture remains attractive for migrants, both with VSS and Tier 5 visa holders. And the reason for that is that it is a perceived low level, and then there is some accommodation offered that is affordable in comparison with other types of accommodation. Experiences vary greatly, and they have to do with the experience of the workers, they have to do with farms. But the one important aspect is that we are now in a situation where we have two very different type of workers. So I've put here some testimonies from the workers that talk particularly about the physical hard labor aspect of this job. It's seasonal, so they have to have another income for the remainder of the year. And we find all sorts of that it fits and different roles in their lives. So for example, we also spoke with a retired person from Romania that would come only 3 months in the UK, not 6, that's the entire duration. And this is something that I will refer in just a second, that we call short-term pre-settled, because the majority of those that we came across with QSS had only pre-settled status, not settled status. There are significant differences because they are working side by side, often in the same field, and they have very different entitlements as workers. They have similar pay, the same pay, but very different rights. So for example, on the tier 5 and the seasonal worker visa, they don't have access to healthcare. Even though they pay national insurance, they're on national minimum wage in the worst of situations, and they cannot bring families. The visa is only for 6 months or shorter and cannot be extended in any circumstances. And there are important concerns. We also found a high range of abuse and name calling that workers reported. Misbehavior, for example, shouting or similar small things like this, but that really made a difference for workers. So now I've kind of started, having looked at the two perspectives, I wanted to put forward a few considerations for the audience, and that will, I hope, start already to lead into the next presentation that we will hear from my colleagues. It's important to acknowledge that first and foremost, farms and rural spaces are now increasingly diverse, and the services, the support is not there. And the farmers need to come to terms with this diversity. And we often speak of dependency, but also we should also refer to contributions that the worker make. Within the space of a farm, there is that acknowledgement, but not necessarily within the local village or small rural place. There are also significant concerns regarding the transition from pre-settled to settled status. 2/3 of our participants only had pre-settled. There's increased difficulty for returnees, and this is a major concern because every farmer we spoke to said they place tremendous value and they trust in those returnees who are more experienced, who they had a good relationship with. And they tend to be also family units. So they tend to be, we often come across the wife, the husband, the cousin, and the brother-in-law, and this would be a group that would travel annually. But similarly, those under the visa system and the tier 5 also had similar networks or friendship groups that they didn't want to come alone. And under the new visa regime, you can only make an individual application, and there is no exception or light route for returnees if they are to come next year. You just start from zero, you would have any chance as anyone else applying. So that's another major concern. We also found that from those with pre-settled status, because this is agriculture and people with lower skills, most importantly, digital illiteracy, that many were very concerned that they couldn't access or access their digital status. And as I said earlier, the short-term pre-settlers that only come for a couple of months. Even when they arrive in the country, they sometimes tend to go to other areas after an initial period of employment in farming and go to another country. And then we have to also consider that these are migrants. This is also an aging population, and there is always a percentage that returns to the country of origin. And having said that, if you want to learn more about our project, just visit our website and follow us on Twitter. And now I will give the floor to my colleagues. Thank you. Dan, your microphone is not working.
Apologies. That's a proper school child error. Sorry. Can I just ask you one question before we move on to the next presentation? We've had a question from Fiona Smith on this Slido about the Pick for Britain campaign and how successful it was. Do you have a sense of how you would evaluate that campaign?
I think that it depends on what you call success. It was successful to draw attention to the need and the concerns in the sector, and it came at a crucial time as well. There were COVID restrictions in time, and borders were difficult to transit at that point in time. It had backing from several influential think tanks, campaign, DEFRA as well, back it, the industry sector. So that in terms of raising awareness, it was very significant and very successful. We've also approached some workers in that campaign who participated, but we don't have a large enough sample for that. We know that it brought, based on estimates from the industry, we don't have any other data, for example, administrative data, but the industry said that they were 5 to 6%, and at one particular point in time, 11% of the workers were British, but their survival, their retention was very, very short. So they would stay for very short periods of time, less than a month usually.
Hey, thanks very much. That's fascinating. Can I also just, so we're going to move on to the EU Migrant Workers project now, and I'll ask Fiona Costello to share her screen. And just while that's happening, can I remind people to ask questions on Slido and vote for the questions you like as we go on. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Can everyone see my slides okay and you can hear me?
Yes, thanks.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. It's an absolute pleasure to be here today to talk to you about our EU Migrant Worker project, which is the research we're undertaking in the east of England. And thank you, Dan, for organising and for inviting us, me with my colleague, Professor Catherine Bernard. For the purposes of our research, we've been working with a charity based in Norfolk that works across Norfolk and Suffolk called JAROS. And JAROS provide multilingual information, advice and guidance to clients to access their service via drop-ins, walk-in drop-ins and follow-up appointments, or through virtual services. During last year in 2020, due to COVID-19, a lot of JAROS's services went remote like other organizations. And as they return to face-to-face advice this year, they've continued their virtual service alongside their face-to-face services. And we've been able to shadow JAROS's drop-ins each week, as well as access their database to see what issues people are accessing support for. The next two slides, I'll talk specifically around EUSS, as we've been shadowing during this period when people needed to make their applications both pre and post deadline. And the data that we're drawing from is around the 2,300 plus applications JAROS have supported people to make over the last 2 years, since September 2019. So I'll talk very briefly about some of the kind of pre-deadline issues, but I think probably more interesting is the current issues they're seeing post-deadline. But in terms of pre-deadline, so one of the issues clients were facing and were accessing support from JAROS around was if they had ID cards or passports that were out of date, or they indeed didn't have in the first instance, they needed to make an application at their consulate or their embassy to get their ID card or passport. And due to COVID lockdowns and embassies and consulates closing, there was actually significant backlogs of appointments available once they reopened. So JAROS would need to support a client to make their appointment, sometimes supporting them even financially to travel to London, which is quite an undertaking from Great Yarmouth, or to pay for their new passport, and then support them to make their application once this ID was in place. And what it meant was it was pushing people's applications closer to the deadline than would otherwise have been the case if they didn't have to wait for these delays. And similarly with paper applications, before the Home Office put these online in the run up to the deadline, if somebody came in and needed to apply via the paper application route, they needed to call the resolution centre, request the form and wait for that to arrive in the post. And there were some postal delays also on the kind of back of the national lockdowns in 2020. So this again was just pushing people and pushing JARIS's workload, I think, closer to that deadline than would otherwise have been the case. Another kind of common trend that we've noticed throughout the research that we've been doing is sometimes around a lack of awareness that people still have to this day, that they need to make an application for EUSS. And JARIS currently have people coming in saying their employers asked for a share code and they don't know what it is. And in actual fact, they haven't made an application in the first instance. And that's how they found out they need to make an application, is through their employer. And certainly significantly in the run up to the deadline, we saw an increase in parents who didn't realize they needed to make an application for their child. And there was various reasons given for this. Either they kind of mistakenly assumed that their application, their child status was linked to their own automatically, or that because the child had been born in the UK, they didn't need to make an application to the scheme. And there was 1 week, I know, in Ipswich where JARIS did 70 applications for children in 1 week just before the deadline. And that was kind of the scale of the rush of demand just before the 30th of June. And kind of alongside this, there was issues around gathering the correct evidence to prove your child's residency in the UK. And some families were really struggling with this. And we've seen the fallout from this at the moment. We've had some families who made applications whose child's application has been refused because they weren't able to generate enough evidence to prove their child's residency here. And JARIS kind of working at the moment to unpick these issues. And finally, an ongoing trend with the scheme is around digital literacy and digital hardware. And the reality of EUSS is it's a digital application system with a digital status. So if your barrier to making an application is your digital literacy, or you don't have a smartphone or access to the internet, then making an application is very difficult. And on the right, you'll see a picture of a gentleman who accessed a drop-in 1 week while I was there. He's been in the UK for 36 years. He's a Dutch national. And this was his phone that he brought to the drop-in to support him to make his application with. He didn't have a computer at home. He wasn't able to use it, and he didn't have access to the internet. So for this gentleman, in reality, while JARIS were able to support him to make an application, actually, once his status is granted, it's quite unusable for him without that ongoing support from JARIS to log in to his EUSS. And then looking at what are the issues now? That was pre-deadline. So what are the issues now? I think number one, and what sticks out from this table, this second table on the slide here, is that JARIS are still seeing people who need to make new applications. And that is kind of their busiest strand of work at the moment. And if you look at the table on the top, you can see actually it's busier than it's ever been. So while the deadline has passed, actually the need for new applications certainly hasn't passed and has only gotten busier. The second strand of work that JARIS are undertaking at the moment is people coming in for help around checking the progress of their application. And these are people who have made an application, but are potentially currently caught in the backlog of decisions and are waiting for a grant of status. And they ask JARIS to help them either call the resolution centre or log into their account to see if there's been any change. And then the third strand of work is around people coming in asking for a share code or for information on how to share their status. And this is probably the piece of work that's expected around this time, because the status is now live and people need it to maybe share with their employer or their landlord or DWP or whoever it may be. And then the fifth row on there I've kept on as well, which is people coming in to update their details. So that's somebody who may have changed their phone number, their email address, or they've had a new ID come in and they come into JARIS for help to update these details on their status. And I think that kind of shows that for a smaller group, but the reality is that EUSS isn't a kind of one and done application. They need ongoing support from JARIS to maintain it and to interact with it. And JARIS aren't one of the Home Office funded organisations. The funding for their support comes through the National Lottery and through Access to Justice funding. And both of these funding streams are time limited. So the reality is there's no guarantee that JARIS will always be around to support these people to interact with their status that they're going to need on an ongoing basis. And we have a case study example here of somebody Jaros worked with, who we'll call Daniel for the sake of the case study, who's a Romanian national who made an application pre-deadline to EUSS, and he needed to send off his Romanian ID card along with his application. He needed to wait 4 months for his ID card to be returned to him while his decision was pending. And in that time, he was unable to find work because he didn't have any ID. So in those 4 months while he was waiting for his ID, he generated a debt of £1,200 from rent and utilities that went unpaid. So he came to Jaros firstly for help with his EUSS, and then secondly for help with the debt that was generated while he was waiting. And this is quite a common theme, I think, amongst Jaros clients, is that they come in for more than one issue and they come in more than once. And I'll speak about that next. But Daniel was able to find work after he had his ID back and his status was granted. He was granted EU pre-settled status, and he found work in a factory on a 0-hour contract, and is working towards paying off that debt that was accrued in the interim period. So as I said, EUSS and issues in general don't happen in isolation. And one of the things we've been able to do working with Jaros is get a copy of download of their database 2015 to 2020. And we're analysing all of the issues for which people are accessing support, and looking at the common trends and themes. And we can see through our analysis the evidence of problem clustering. Problems tend not to happen in isolation. The average time that somebody interacts with Jaros services is 16 months, and over 50% of clients access Jaros services for more than one issue at a time. And the graph on the right of your screen there kind of shows the commonly clustered issues that we can see from our analysis, which are around employment, rented housing, welfare benefits, and debt. And we can also see evidence in our analysis of the kind of intensive bureaucratic bordering that migrant communities are facing, and the problems that this causes and then clusters around to other problems or leads to other problems. This is particularly evident around, for example, claiming welfare benefits. And during the period of time that we're looking at, 2015 to 2020, an EU national would have needed to prove that they were exercising a treaty right, they were habitually resident, and they were exercising treaty rights, such as working in order to claim welfare benefits. And if you're not in the right kind of employment, in the right rented housing, this can be very difficult. And what I mean when I say the right kind of employment and rented housing is that you're generating the paperwork needed to meet these eligibility requirements. And there's evidence in the database of people not receiving payslips or not receiving a contract of employment, or indeed in some instances not being paid. And those are those crucial bits of documents you need to prove you've been working. And similarly, people in more informal housing situations where housing referrals tend to come through word of mouth. So you know a friend in a HMO, then there's a room available and you're able to access that room, and you pay for your rent in cash. Your bills are included also in cash, so you're not on the utility bills. And then this can really cause significant barriers when claiming welfare benefits, or as we've seen, and as we've discussed, when making your EUSS application in order to regularise your status in the UK, where you haven't been generating those key documents that you need, which in turn leads to debt. And they all kind of cluster together and then continue on. So that's one of the findings that we've been digging a little bit deeper into at the moment in our research. And then to finish up, looking at the future and the issues that we're looking at the moment, and maybe it would be interesting to talk about a little bit more in the discussion afterwards. One of the big issues, and we're doing something on this shortly, is around advice sharks. So advice shark practice isn't new, but it does seem to have flourished during COVID-19 when regulated accredited services went remote and online. Advice sharks were still operating in communities, and we're seeing examples of people who have paid sometimes extortionate amounts of money for someone to support them to make an EUSS claim, and now they're finding the claim hasn't been submitted, or it's been submitted incorrectly, or indeed the advice shark holds their login details and the individual themselves is unable to access their own status. And we're seeing the fallout and impact of this practice on individuals who are then coming to Jaros for help. In the last couple of weeks, Jaros has seen a significant increase in people coming for help to update the DWP as of their EUSS status. And we're following the progress of that, including some individuals who haven't had a status yet. So they've been asked to update their status, but they're still waiting in the backlog and are unable to do so for the moment. I think we're seeing still this kind of steady stream of applications for children. As I've discussed, many children for whom applications haven't been made as yet. And I think across frontline staff, there's an understanding that there are still a number of children, and it's kind of difficult to tell the scale, and it may not be for years to come until we truly understand how many children might have been left out during this period of EUS applications. We're doing a small piece on healthcare needs of migrant communities, looking at of course, during COVID-19, but also looking at the bigger database that we have access to over the last 5 years. What are the healthcare needs that people have been supporting GYROS for, and looking at those. We've also recently, GYROS have seen a bit of an upswing in people accessing the service who have moved to the UK after December 2020, after free movement ended, and they have been kind of living and working here. They've been able to make an application for EUSS, so they have a certificate of application. So they've been able to work and rent, but of course their application will be refused because they've moved here after freedom of movement ended. We've also written a piece on non-EU family members and paper applications to the EUSS scheme, and our current blog on that is available on the UK and Changing Europe website, and we're looking to update the data on that. Our current blog goes up until March 2021, and when we have the data, we'll hopefully update that up until the deadline and beyond, and how paper applications looked. At the time, it was clear that non-EU family members were struggling to successfully interact with the EU settlement scheme, and there was a much higher refusal rate up until March. And then finally, and I think Roxanne has already spoken about this, but one of the big issues on the horizon will be those who have been awarded pre-settled status who need to move to settled status. And 43% of applicants have received pre-settled status. It's about 2 million plus people. And if their barrier was around digital literacy or not having the correct paperwork, and nothing kind of changes in the interim, it is very likely they will face the same issues when they go to make their second application for settled status. I'll leave it there. Thank you very much, everybody, and I look forward to questions and discussion at the end.
Thanks so much, Fiona. That was fascinating. If I could just put a question to you quickly now that's come up. So the question is, if European workers need advice about their migration status or living in the UK while working, where would they go? Is such advice accessible? And we're going to hear from a project which in a moment, which is exactly involved in giving advice. But your work with GYROS is significant and interesting in that context. And, you talked about the difference between the regulated advice givers and advice sharks and so on. I just wonder if you could give a bit more of a sense of what kind of an organization GYROS is and how typical it is. So, in other towns in the east of England, would people be able to find a similar thing, or is it, are there kind of advice deserts as well? How sustainable is that kind of work, that sort of thing?
Absolutely. So it is a bit of a postcode lottery. It does depend on where you live. So GYROS are, as I said, accredited to give immigration advice, and there are other accredited organizations around the country, and you can get that information on the OISC website as to where your nearest accredited organization might be. And as I said, the Home Office have funded 72 organizations nationally to help people make their EUSS applications. And I believe I read somewhere recently they've extended that funding till next March, so that support continues. But certainly it is a postcode lottery. It does depend where you live. There's other organizations we work with in Kings Lynn, for example, called Access, who also work in Wisbech, and GYROS across Norfolk and Suffolk. But it is sometimes, I think it's a matter of trying to find out where your local organization is, if there is one available. And of course, if you don't speak English or you don't have good digital literacy skills, that is going to be a struggle for people. Thanks
very much. So now if we hand over to Charlotte and Alice for the final presentation.
Great. Has that screen sharing worked?
Yes.
Great, thank you. I need to position myself in such a way that I'm the exact spot that the sunlight isn't dazzling. Yeah, thank you so much to Dan and to Hannah for organising this and for bringing us together. It's fascinating hearing about the other projects and thinking about the overlaps as well. So obviously I'm already very well aware of the magnificent work that Roxana and Fiona and Catherine are doing. We are running the EU Rights and Brexit Hub. We, as in myself plus Alice Welsh. Now, the hub has three main streams. There's the clinic, stakeholder interviews and statistical data. The clinic is a second-tier advice clinic. So we work with organisations who do first-tier work. So organisations who do face-to-face advice with EU nationals, like citizens advice organisations. We've also had queries from housing associations, other advice organisations that exist, who need some form of specialist support in the context of rights of EU nationals after Brexit, in particular, accessing public services. And as we're doing the advice work, we're compiling an advice-led ethnography. So we're putting together, documenting the evidence of the problems that people are encountering. And there is a sort of a third strand of that, which is then using that evidence for some policy and campaigns related work. The stakeholder interviews are conducted largely through co-investigators, Professor Simon Parker and John Evermy, who are based in the politics department at York, and they are doing a range of interviews drawing upon our findings. And they're also doing a whole host of other things like putting together parliamentary questions, which we've had asked in Parliament, and responding to consultations. And the statistical side of things is under the auspices of Compass, which is part of the Migration Observatory based in Oxford. And they put together some of the quant stuff, looking at the how we extrapolate our findings and what are the implications by considering how many EU nationals are in different areas and how much they use certain services and that sort of thing. One of the joys of this project, one of the joys of this programme, is the ability to sort of work with experts who are far more qualified than me in these particular areas. But obviously, for the purposes of today, we're focusing on the clinic and in particular the gaps that we have discovered between law and practice, or law and guidance. Because within the clinic, there's a whole host of things that we look at, in particular, the huge swathes of legislation that have come in, particularly a bombardment of secondary legislation. And there's a whole load of legal analysis that goes on. But we're leaving that to one side for today, focusing on the problems, the more administrative problems that we've been encountering. So one glaring example of this is the situation surrounding pre-settled status. So we heard from the previous speakers about the EU settled status scheme, the two different statuses that exist. And people with pre-settled status, the government decided that it was going to introduce legislation to exclude them from accessing key benefits by virtue of that status. That they could access benefits, but they had to have another right to reside as well, and which creates a bunch of problems for certain groups of people, particularly vulnerable people. And this rule was found unlawful by the Court of Appeal, that found it was unlawful discrimination, and the court quashed the relevant regulations, saying that people with pre-settled status should be able to use that status to get benefits. Now, what they did was they stayed the effects of that decision, and there's ongoing litigation that's being appealed to the Supreme Court. There's a whole host of dramatic litigious developments with a parallel case going to the Court of Justice. But again, leaving that to one side, if you're interested in all that stuff, we've got a series of blogs on the Hub website, because we are extremely nerdy about this stuff. However, leaving that aside, in the meantime, what we have is a Court of Appeal ruling that quashes the regs, albeit stays that quash. Now, the decision maker guidance for people who are administering benefit decisions has been amended to only partly reflect this. So the DWP accept that the regs are quashed, and therefore people making applications for benefits on facts based before the end of the exit transition period, before 31st of December 2020, They should not have their applications refused outright. They should be stayed pending the outcome at the Supreme Court. But the guidance says, but the Court of Appeal judgment only applies until the end of December. Therefore, just apply the regs as normal for anything since then, which is an extraordinary kind of novel approach to the quashing of regulations. The idea that the DWP can put a time limit on something that the Court of Appeal has not put a time limit on, that it can unquash a quash, is an extremely innovative idea, not least attempting to do it through guidance rather than through law. And what's more is we've seen cases in which decision makers have relied upon that guidance, where they've said that as or because the application was made after the 1st of January, we can rely on the regulations without any further discussion of the litigation, which is kind of disturbing, really. And speaking of people with greater expertise than me, this is the point where I hand over to Alice for this discussion.
For this one slide. The title of this slide comes from a pretty disturbing quote that Charlotte found from her previous project, which looked at access to benefits before Brexit. And this was when she was in discussion with a decision maker about what the law actually said, to which the decision maker replied, well, we don't follow the law, we follow the guidance. And that is a common theme that we are continuing to see in this project, and most regularly with individuals who are working. So as Charlotte said, if you have pre-settled status, you have to establish an additional right to reside. And this is most commonly done through work. There's other ways too, but I won't go into detail about that. Let's focus on worker for now. The EU definition of work is incredibly broad. It includes part-time work, it includes casual work. There's also case law that covers people who have cash in hand work, who don't necessarily receive pay slips, that they should still be able to be recognised as a worker and establish a right to reside to access benefits if they are working and being economically active. The UK introduced from 2014, introduced an earnings threshold to help decision makers streamline cases to say, oh, if people are earning this much, if they meet class 1 national insurance contributions for 3 months, they're automatically a worker. And if they don't meet that, then follow the rest of the EU law. The problem in the guidance is that it's very confusing. It prioritises this earnings threshold. It refers decision makers back to earnings when they're supposed to be looking at all these other factors. And we've seen that in practice, the minimum earnings threshold is actually decisive, even though it really shouldn't be. And we've seen this in a number of occasions for a variety of different work. There's just an overall failure for decision makers to even consider work beyond the earnings threshold. We've seen lots of cases that involve full-time workers on permanent contracts who have applied for benefits or housing support and been told that they're not a worker, even though they're full-time and permanent workers, because they've only worked 2 months. So how could they meet the minimum earnings threshold? Because we need 3 months of earnings. And that's just a complete failure to consider the rest of the law that should be backing up this worker status. And yeah, we've just seen a kind of continuing trend of the guidance being elevated to a position that's beyond the law. However, this problem is common. A lot of benefit decision makers will be like, yeah, we see this all the time. Not the benefit advisors even will say, we see this all the time. It's quite easily fixed. If you present the law to the decision maker and say, you've got this wrong, you need to take account of this, this, and this, it will often be overturned. And we've seen this ourselves when we've included letters that explains why we think the individual is a worker. The decision has been overturned. But obviously that's not how you necessarily want your decisions being made. So I'll pass back over to Charlotte.
Great, thanks, Alice. And so another example of confusing guidance relates to the genuine prospects of work tests that we've encountered. So the test here was introduced many years ago for people who wanted to retain their worker status. If they fulfilled the criteria set down in EU law, they also had to show that they had genuine prospects of work, and this test was set down in guidance. Now, this was found unlawful by the upper tribunal in the UK in February 2020. However, nothing was really done tum-ty-tum-ty-tum by DWP to action this finding of it being unlawful until in December 2020, they introduced a memo to the decision maker guidance saying, by the way, this case says you don't do a genuine prospects of work test. But this was a memo that was appended to a huge body of decision maker guidance, which remained unchanged, which had the polar opposite information in it. So the main body of the guidance told in great detail and several steps the decision makers should apply a genuine prospects of work test. And it was only if they went to the right place, clicked on a memo and read the memo that they might get the right information. But even then they might be confused that there are two completely diametrically opposed bits of information about the guidance. Now, we picked up on this and we got in contact with the Child Poverty Action Group, who worked with us to write to some of the people in charge of the ADM to see if they could get it changed. And we got effectively the brush off. We were told, oh yes, it'll be changed in due course. It's just taking us a while to do something about it. Bear in mind, this was around May this year from a ruling that was in February 2020. And what's more, as they said, but because of the memo, we know that decision makers know what they're supposed to do. We've told them what they're supposed to do. They'll be making the correct decisions. Now, what stood in stark contrast with this was the fact that we had some very recent decision letters where it wasn't just the content of the decision that was dodgy, the template letter had a template table illustrating what types of right to reside were available and how you had to meet them. And the template table in the template letter gave great detail about needing to meet the genuine prospects of work test. This thing that we were being told by DWP, decision makers weren't applying, and yet they were putting it in all their letters that they were sending to claimants. And so we raised this with the Work and Pensions Select Committee, who were quite interested, and Stephen Timms, the chair, got in contact with us for some more detail to write himself to DWP, and then got a letter back in September this year, assuring him that there was a plan to change the ADM, but now giving a commitment of sometime between 4 to 6 weeks. I have checked today, still not been changed. Still the offending bits in it, and the fact that until recently we have been seeing these decisions based on this incorrect guidance or the application of a test that should not exist. We haven't yet seen the new letters that we're being told should exist now without the dodgy guidance. So back to Alice.
So I'm just going to cover a bit more of the general decision maker error we're seeing. So we've seen there's issues with the guidance. It's incredibly confusing and it can mislead decision makers, but also even where the guidance is relatively clear, it's complex. As Charlotte alluded to, there's many different regulations being introduced. Policies are changing depending on what date individuals were in the country, what date they had a status, what kind of status they had. So it is incredibly complex, and there are errors being made frequently. In particular, we've seen issues with individuals with pre-settled status. Before the end of the transition period, we saw decisions being made that individuals with pre-settled status just could not access benefits, full stop. That was usually with local authorities who then, once it was explained to them that actually they could, and this was how they did it. And moreover, it wasn't even the end of the transition period yet, so it didn't matter whether they had pre-settled status or not, they could still rely on old rules. Then things would work out, but we had to, there's usually a lot of informing and explaining of the rules involved. More recently, we've seen a decision made at the universal credit level with an individual pre-settled status where the decision maker applied the wrong rules to them and said, it's not important if you're working now, it doesn't matter. It's more important, we need to see that you worked in December 2020 and that you've continued to work since. That was just not the rules at all. And that misunderstanding was communicated to a benefits advisor at the point of mandatory reconsideration, so at the point of review of an initial decision. And once again, once we wrote a letter explaining all the rules and exactly how that client didn't have to show he was working back in December. As it happened, he was, but they refused to look at that evidence too. But how he still met the criteria to access benefits, and that decision was overturned, but it was only after we had to spell out exactly what the regulations said. And very recently, we've seen an example just this week from a local authority where their decision letter on housing benefit says we cannot award you housing benefit because you are not a permanent resident of the United Kingdom. That is not the case. You do not have to be a permanent resident to access housing benefit. And we have now got permission to take this up with the local authority, and we will be raising it also with the Independent Monitoring Authority to try and get those mistakes overturned because they are happening, they are frequent, and they lead to terrible decisions which can have huge impact on individual lives. So I'll hand back to Charlotte.
Great, thanks. Now, I noticed that there was a question in the Slido about whether the effects or whether there were knock-on effects of EUSS delays upon other entitlements. Well, today is your lucky day. It turns out we have a slide all about this. Now, we have witnessed some extraordinary delays, which tend to be disguised when the government talks about the average waiting time, and the average waiting time sounding quite short, but some of the outliers are scandalous and result in really significant and severe detriment and disadvantage. We saw one case with a client who waited for 15 months, a non-EEA mother, and she had children, and she had been refused universal credit because she couldn't establish a right to reside the normal way because she couldn't access the details of her husband's work history because they were estranged, and so was reliant upon her settled status, but was not being awarded her settled status. There was this huge delay in processing the settled status application. When it eventually came through, by the time it came through, she'd missed out on 13 months worth of universal credit payments, and as a result had been accessing food banks. And this is someone who it was shown was unequivocally entitled to settled status and therefore to equal treatment and therefore to benefits, and being reliant upon food banks. But she couldn't backdate the universal credit because she was only eligible from it from the date of the award of the settled status, which was the date they actually made the decision, not the point at which she applied for it. And that just feels, I mean, it's not only such a disadvantage, but it's such an injustice, really. And another example of a case where a paper application was made actually at the point of the deadline. It had to be a paper application because the woman in question had lost her ID and all her documents in a fire in December 2020. And as of now, she is still waiting for a certificate of application. So she can't even evidence the fact that she's made an application, albeit one right at the deadline. And she's been offered several jobs and she's not been able to actually take them up because she doesn't have any evidence that she has an eligibility to work. Now I'll hand over back to Alice.
Wonderful. So this is the last slide. I'll go through it very quickly. We've heard quite a lot about digital status. It's causing quite a few problems. Very early on, we saw issues with DWP, with the helpline not even knowing how it worked, saying to a client who was receiving support, oh no, don't worry, we don't need to see that. I'm not going to take those details from you. And then finding out later that they were refused universal credit because they failed to share details of their digital status. These issues have slightly been improved because the DWP introduced kind of a cross-departmental checking system, but that's not the case for landlords. That's not the case for employers who are also having to do these checks. And we're particularly worried about the concern with that. There's lots of issues with digital status. If you are interested, I've done a kind of shameless plug of a paper that's just come out, which covers some of these. It is an ongoing issue, and we've heard a lot more about it from Fiona. And just kind of overall, just to conclude, we've seen a lot of cases that aren't necessarily issues with the law, and there's lots of issues with the law, but issues with how the law is being applied to people's lives. And these are kind of the issues that are very difficult to find sometimes, but also very difficult to overturn because the law says the right thing. Sometimes it just isn't applied properly. And I think a common theme that we are seeing at the first half of this project is there's not so much an interest in decision makers getting it right, There's not an interest in improving guidance or providing training. There seems to be more of a willingness for decision makers to get it wrong and then fix little bits when they're caught out. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks very much, Alice, and thanks, Charlotte. That's really fascinating, and you know, there's a strong theme in the socio-legal literature about the gaps between the rules in the books and what happens in reality and on the ground. And your project, you know, especially in relation to the EUSS scheme, is just showing that those gaps are huge. I wonder if I could ask you, if it's not too sort of speculative, to maybe expand a little bit on that last point about why the gap isn't being closed, and clearly a project like yours is closing the gap in a range of particular cases, but that doesn't seem to be, from what you've said, creating pressure that's effectively triggering a revision of the guidance to make it more in line with the formal laws. And do you have, from any part of the project, any insight into, you know, why not?
Alice, do you want to tackle that one?
Yeah, I can give it a go. I mean, a lot of it is speculation, because I can't say for why they're not reviewing it. I will. It is concerning. There's a lot that could be done. I mentioned a few in that there could be more training. There used to be a specialist unit that would deal with EU cases before Brexit. That had problems in itself. It was hard to ever get hold of them, and they were kind of up in an office in the tip of Scotland. But as far as we're aware now, that unit doesn't exist. So there's not necessarily the support there for decision makers who are dealing with quite complex, multi-level, multi-layered situations where people are looking at immigration status and then EU law and then what the UK has said about it and all of that. So yeah, I'm not sure why. I guess that I can't answer your question directly. Charlotte, do you have anything you want to add about that?
Yeah, so I have 4 suggested reasons, or 4 suggested contributing factors. One is lack of bandwidth. You know, we've got a government that's already massively overwhelmed, civil service massively overwhelmed with what's going on in terms of dealing with COVID and dealing with Brexit and all the secondary legislation and stuff, and the ameliorating measures being put in place means that there's clearly not that much of an interest in dealing with what seems like an unimportant bit of guidance, albeit wrong guidance. Lack of political will, because this is by and large a cohort that cannot vote in general elections, and so where is the pressure to actually care about them? Lack of specialist institutional knowledge, which is something that Alice alluded to there with the disappearance of the EU casework a bit, and the introduction of really complicated parallel immigration systems just contributes to all of those things. The fact that we've now got, you know, what was already a complicated system, now we've got this whole different set of immigration rules depending on whether you arrive before the end of transition, or if you arrive after transition, or if you have family members arriving at different points in time, and it's excruciatingly complicated and confusing, and I suspect it is that for decision makers too.
Thanks so much. Perhaps you could stop sharing your screen and we can then bring all the presenters together. Fantastic, thank you. I'm going to throw out the top question on the Slido and see if anyone wants to pick it up. The question as it's written is, to what extent can staff shortages in hospitals and of lorry drivers be attributed to Brexit and or the government's, quote, hostile environment, end quote, policy. I mean, I guess I'd throw into that maybe an element of the impacts of the COVID pandemic as well, which I think is probably an important element in that mix. Now, I know that hospital workers and lorry drivers aren't a particular focus for any of these projects, but those groups, or indeed any other groups where there are shortages or perceived shortages. Does anyone want to have a go at that? Catherine, thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for those excellent presentations. Specifically on lorry drivers, there's a number of factors. It's thought there's a shortage of about 100,000 lorry drivers. It's also thought that of those, about 15 to 20% may be EU drivers. So I think it's more complicated than just saying it's all Brexit. It's a combination of factors. One, yes, up to 15 to 20,000 EU drivers probably have gone back to their own countries, or they've actually had the opportunity to get work and possibly easier work where they don't have to cross harder borders by going back to Poland or Lithuania, and they can service 27 member states from there rather than staying in the UK. Secondly, in the UK, it's an aging population of lorry drivers. And certainly during COVID, people experienced a different pace of life. And therefore, for those who are coming up to retirement, they might have taken early retirement anyway. And thirdly, there's been decades of underinvestment in infrastructure. So as we all know, you see lorry drivers sleeping on the side in cabs on the side of the road. No toilets, no showers, and it's all pretty grim. And the final issue is also the working time of drivers. So it may well be the case that they're actually only paid the hours they're driving and not the hours for putting goods on and off the lorries. And again, this is a hard job. It's actually a responsible job, albeit in the UK immigration system, it is seen as a low-skilled job. And therefore, you cannot get what the new global visa, tier 2, the replacement for tier 2, because it's not on the list of occupations that are covered, because it's considered low skilled.
Thanks so much, Catherine. That's fascinating. Does anyone else want to come in? Roxana.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think just to complement what Catherine said, which is very, very good and very true, there's also questions that they wouldn't necessarily qualify as easily with the language requirements required for higher tier 2 visa, for example, that are quite high at level of A levels. That is not needed for such a job. There have been many who have returned home also to European countries, and this is also a question for the entire food system, for example, shortages across the food systems, and it has to do with currency as well, how that is tipping the balances. And to say that in the EU, this has been dealt with in the past as well through the Posted Workers Directive, which now UK has no longer access to. And workers have moved into other sectors where there is more increased flexibility with time, work and pay, such as Amazon delivery, rather than more longer term and being away from families for longer, as you would as a lorry driver. Thank you.
Fantastic, thanks very much. One of the themes that's coming through a number of the questions is a kind of concern about what the kind of medium to longer term impact of this situation might be. So we have a question, for example, about the possibility of a Windrush type scandal emerging through this this context that we find ourselves in at the moment. There are obviously a lot of issues in the short term about delays, about differences between the law and the guidance, and the impact of delays on people's lives, their ability to work, their ability to claim benefits, and so on. But do you think there's a risk this is storing up a longer term problem or set of problems for the UK?
I think I'm happy to start if that's all right. I think it's a very difficult one to answer, because actually when you look at the numbers of applications to EUSS, you know, there's been over 6 million applications. So it's hard to think that there may be people who haven't applied because it was so much more oversubscribed than people thought that it would be. But actually when we're looking at the GIROS data, as I discussed, you know, they're still as busy as ever. There certainly are people who missed the deadline and who are applying. So in the longer term, because we never knew how many EU nationals needed to apply, it's very difficult, despite the large numbers, to know how many might have missed the deadline. I think for me, the biggest concern, as I said, is probably around children and young people who may not have had an application and who may not realize for many years to come that they are without a status because they interact with less kind of borders, internal borders, than an adult might do, for example. But thankfully, young people can make applications up until the age of 18. So it will be a matter at that point, hopefully it's able to be unraveled fairly quickly once they realize that they are without a status.
That's fascinating, and this huge underestimate of the number of people who might be making these settled status applications, you know, really comes through the research evidence. Another project that Roxana works on, the Northern Exposure Project, which is working in a number of kind of towns and cities across the north of England. In some of those places, in a place like Wakefield, for example, you know, they've discovered numbers of EU EEA migrants that they just, you know, the local authority just had no idea were living in the local community, which perhaps offers a different kind of perspective on some of the gaps between the law and the guidance. I've been thinking about a brilliant book by James Scott called Seeing Like a State, and you know, the sense that the UK state really struggles to read society, to have, you know, effective knowledge about what's happening across the piece, you know, seems to come through quite powerfully. I mean, here I've also got, not sparing her blushes and maybe a bit of a plug, Charlotte's brilliant book, Unity in Adversity, which was a kind of precursor to the project that's happening now in the post-Brexit period, but looking at exactly the same sort of set of problems and pioneering this this sort of advice-led ethnographic approach. And it all suggests that that there's a kind of connection missing in how the government kind of learns about and knows about the society that it's seeking to govern, and you know, there are all sorts of reasons for the problems, the scandalous problems around Windrush, but a lack of understanding, of self-understanding, seems to me to be partly what's at issue, what's at stake there. There's another question in the Slido, which is about diversity, which I think has come through a number of the presentations, maybe perhaps most powerfully and clearly through Roxana's. And it says the area of diversity is interesting. Diversity of the workforce, skills will bring innovation for climate change goals, the question or the comment suggests. But I guess, again, it links to this idea about how well the UK state kind of understands the society it's governing. You know, from your sort of on the ground research, do you think there's more diversity than was anticipated? Does anyone want to pick that question up?
I can make a start. But I think that's a really important question. For example, for farming that we looked at, There are very good data, agriculture censuses, and records of the food system and analysis. There is a good check on that, but they often didn't look at the workers across the system. Or, for example, the Environmental and Food and Rural Affairs Committee has looked and done quite a lot of work in these areas, and seasonal workers were always flagged up. But, for example, they didn't include lorry drivers in those analyses as key or acute shortages in the system. There is that on one side, and then the industry as well didn't speak of that need, didn't take stock of their diverse workforce and what their needs are. And I'm not sure that even to this day they understand that these are migrants. They are highly volatile, they have their needs, they travel in groups, in families. Wi-Fi, for example, just simple things like having good Wi-Fi on farms so that they can be in contact with their families. And this is still a struggle. And it's so important on their daily lives to have that available, because they live on farm, remote from any other areas. So that's a really important aspect to have, and just to tackle abuse in the area. And some of the farmers were telling us that they would go in town and see how their workers would be abused in supermarkets, that they were also blamed for bringing migrants. So there really is here something more to be done in this area. And just to talk about contribution, perhaps the best example looking forward is the NHS, that has a diverse workforce, and they've been constantly working in the area. There's been more work being done now, but this has been always the case, and we see work being done only in the recent years, or if not months.
Thanks. So one of the questions is about short-term recruitment strategies employers are using, given current shortfalls in labour supply and so on. And you know, from research that I've done with UK Interchange in Europe into the preferences and attitudes of people who supported Leave in the referendum, you know, one of the things that comes through very clearly from that is a sense that that the UK would after Brexit be in a position to make choices about which migrants were kind of brought in, and choices based on what are seen to be the needs of British or UK society. So these short-term recruitment strategies would be, as it were, turning on the tap when we need a flow of workers, and I'd be interested in, you know, reflections on how effective that would be. I mean, I guess picking up on what Roxana's just said, you know, the idea of picking and choosing and just getting exactly the people that quote unquote we need will face difficulties given the complexity, you know, the diversity, the familial contexts and so on of the people involved. But any reflections on short-term employment strategies and their effectiveness? Catherine?
I wonder if I can say a couple of things. We are dealing with people here, not machines. So turning people on and off like a tap is not so straightforward, not least because people have got families and homes and commitments in their own country. And of course, if they're EU nationals, there's plenty of work available in France and Germany in these relatively low-skilled sectors. And for many, it's more attractive to stay in the EU because they can rely on their free movement rights, rather than having to go through an agency for temporary work in the UK. And so I think what we will see going forward is that we will see fewer EU nationals coming to the UK and more from non-EU states. Indeed, Fiona and I visited a farm a couple of weeks ago in Norfolk, and there were some Romanians and Bulgarians who had, some of whom had pre-settled status. There's a large number of Ukrainians, and I think this is what we may see going forward. But I think it's really important to remember that applying for a visa in the UK is not a pleasant process. applying for a visa anyway. It's not a pleasant process, and it's very expensive. Now, if they come on the T5 route, it will be, they have to go through one of 4 accredited agencies, one of which is, I think, at least one of which is the charity Concordia. And so Concordia does quite a lot of the practical work, but there is still a cost. But if you're coming on a skilled worker visa, the costs are really significant, and it depends slightly how you do factor in do the sums. But if you're coming with a family, there's 4 of you, 2 parents and 2 children, you know, you're looking at somewhere in the region of about £17,000 for a 5-year visa plus health service surcharge, not to mention the intrusive questioning that is asked. So the final thing I would say on this point is that, as we know, the government has slightly relaxed the rules for butchers, for poultry workers, and for HGV drivers. What's interesting is how reticent the government has been to publish the figures on how many people have actually applied. There was a story in the Times that only 27 workers had applied under one of the schemes. And of course, it's for a very short period of time. Now, for some people that might be attractive because they're away from their family and for a short period of time. They can earn more than they can in Ukraine, and so it might be the incentive to come. But for others, they say, why disrupt my life for 3 to 6 months, particularly if the borders close again because of COVID.
Thanks, Catherine. That's fascinating stuff, and the unwillingness of the government to release data about how effective these schemes have been is interesting, and I suppose concerning as well. We have a question specifically for Charlotte and Alice. Before I ask it, I'd just like to again, well, thank the audience very much, and again remind you all that we have a post-event survey on the Slido system, and I should be really grateful if you'd fill it out to help us understand how we can make these events as good as they can be, especially as this is the first event of this kind that we've run. I have to say I've really enjoyed it and learned a lot from it, so thanks very much to all the panelists and for the questions asked. So we have this question specifically for Charlotte and Alice, and I'll ask that, and then also if you have any kind of final observations or thoughts, a burning point you want to make, please make it now, and then I'll run through the other 3 panelists for those sort of last words kind of moments. So Alice and Charlotte, do you happen to have data on implementation or people's experience on the ground at the UK's external border, including questions about proof of status? So is that an issue that's come up in your research at all?
That is a great question, and because of the nature of the work that we do and receiving second-tier queries, we're not likely to encounter much that's to do with sort of border enforcement. But we do know it's being widely reported in The Guardian, in particular by Amelia Gentleman, that EU nationals are facing problems at the border, particularly with regard to this non-physical, this digital status that border guards are confused by, don't really understand, don't really trust, and people being sort of detained and otherwise inconvenienced. And there are a number of organisations who are sort of frontline organisations who are working to support people in those sorts of positions, who I hope will be compiling some sort of evidence or some sort of report on exactly these experiences. So the 3 Million, JCWI, the Joint Council for the Welfare of Immigrants, the AIR Centre, and the We Are Settled and New Europeans and Public Law Project, all people who are working with people who will be encountering these sorts of problems. So my advice there would be to keep an eye on what they issue, what kind of reports they come up with. Final thought. I'll just check with Alice if she wants to add anything. But final thing that I wanted to say was do read the fantastic article that Alice has co-authored on discrimination and digital status, because it really is very eye-opening in terms of the different vectors and different protected characteristics that are involved in terms of people, on the grounds of age, disability, gender, nationality, etc. You'll regret it if you don't.
Thank you.
I will just add quickly, because it's linked, about digital status and at the border and the problems that it's causing. I think this is one of my main concerns going forward. There's the likelihood of there's a potential windrush problem with applications. There's a potential windrush problem with transition from pre-settled status to settled status that might happen in the future. But there's also this problem with digital status, and we saw from Fiona's presentation that there's going to be many people with this digital status who don't know how to access it and will never be able to access it without support, and might lose access to the necessary security information that they need to access it. And that is essentially putting at risk people being separated from their immigration status, let alone all the sides with the technical problems that could go on from the government side. So I would just inject that, which kind of speaks to about 3 different questions. But yeah, that's kind of one of my main points I'm worried about going forward.
Thanks very much. Fiona?
Oh, brilliant. Thank you. I suppose my kind of final remarks on where we are at the moment, and thinking about the title of the topic today, Migration After Brexit, I think Catherine has already mentioned it, is that I think we're at a very interesting time, and actually communities that we, for example, JARS have been working with may change over the next couple of years with the end of free movement. And now locally at farms we've been visiting, we're seeing a kind of majority Ukrainian nationals, which have been new communities and they haven't worked with before. But I think on the flip side of that, we also have much better data than we ever had before. We didn't know how many EU nationals were living in local communities. And I know, speaking to some people at Great Yarmouth Borough Council, they were very surprised by the numbers of applications they've had under the EUSS. So we're starting from a better foundation, I think, than we had before, of people who have applied, which I think is only a good thing.
Fantastic, thanks. Yeah, and that point about surprise seems to be echoed in local authorities, wherever you speak to them, really. Catherine?
No, I just wanted to say we owe a large debt of gratitude, actually, to the people we're working with, who are very generous with their time and let us talk to them and find out what's going on. And we're particularly grateful to JARS for actually opening up their books to us so that we can really see what's going on. It's always uncomfortable to be subject to external scrutiny. And so we're very grateful to these organisations for sharing their knowledge and experience with us.
Thanks, Catherine. That's a really important point. This kind of research is inevitably sort of co-produced, and that brings with it huge advantages, but also particular sensitivities, and the importance of sustaining relationships of trust is critical. So the last word then to Roxana.
Thank you very much, and really enjoyed this panel with a wonderful project and learn more about your recent findings. I would just echo what was said earlier and add that the surprise indicates a lack of representation as well of voices due to lack of voting rights, and the way diversity and then communities are brought into conversation with local authorities, with statutory agencies, with state departments that don't necessarily speak across, especially from the Home Office to other departments. As a Romanian myself, we always knew how big the community is. There's also some people that are on USS and are no longer here, and it's a specific concern, a particular concern, that those 2 million are not going to make it. And in our study, we found, and we estimate about 15% that cannot access their digital status, cannot demonstrate it or access it because they've had others that applied and don't have the skills to show. So certainly there's a big issue, concern them moving forward. And for the farming sector, long-term trajectory is next year, because you plan things every year. So there's a question of also what happens next year and how we organize around that. And the final point that I wanted to say is that there's also here seeing as a state, but also looking at what happens in devolved nations, because there are certain characteristics. For For example, in Northern Ireland, there is easy way forward in the south, crossing the border, and then you are in the EU for the EU citizens and having all the rights associated with. There's not so much for tier 5 visa holders. Therefore, we will see less and less Europeans. And as Catherine alluded to before, there will be more, particularly the seasonal workers and the new lorry drivers and poultry and butcher workers have been recruited. That is true in Ukraine. 90% of the visa holders are from the Ukraine. But there's a question as well of sustainability of that pool, because we've looked and most European countries also recruit from Ukraine. So there's that EU neighborhood policy with the Eastern European states that also plays a role, and they have mobility agreements. So they are competing between very similar pools, the UK. And there's a question as well of the image of the UK that we're transmitting, the image of different sectors, and exactly that message is not a nice one that you can turn the tap and bring people for this amount of days even. Thank you.
Thanks so much. You know, I found this an absolutely fascinating afternoon's discussion. These are 3 projects funded by the Economic and Social Research Council that are all working in this sociological or socio-legal vein, and filling the gap or occupying that gap exactly between, you know, some of the things we can know from big aggregate data by working on the ground in various kinds of ways, and that work is absolutely essential, I think, if we're to make sense of where we are. And these 3 projects are brilliant examples of how effective that can be. So I'd really like to thank all the panelists, and I'd like to thank the audience, and thank you for your questions. I'd like to thank also Hannah Richardson and colleagues in the office at UK and Changing Europe, who've kind of held my hand and led me through making this kind of an event work. So thanks to all of them, and thanks to the panelists. And we'll end the live stream now. Thank you.
Thank you.